Part 9, Book 1 of From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Livy. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius, translated by George Baker. Book 1, Part 9. Tarquinius, having thus acquired possession of Gabii, concluded a peace with the nation of the Equans, renewed a treaty with the Etrurians, and then turned his thoughts to the internal business of the city, among which the object of his principal concern was to leave the temple of Jupiter on the Tarpeian Mount a monument of his reign and of his name, to testify that of two Tarquinii, both of whom reigned, the father had vowed, and the son completed it. And in order that the ground might be clear from the interference of any of the other gods, and the temple to be erected thereon be appropriated wholly to Jupiter, he determined to cancel the inauguration of the temples and chapels, several of which had been vowed, first by Tatius during the very heat of the battle against Romulus, and afterwards consecrated there. It is related that during the preparations for founding this structure the gods exerted their divine power to exhibit indications of the stability of this great empire, for, whilst the birds admitted the cancelling the inaugurations of all the other chapels, they did not give the signs of approbation in the case of the temple of Terminus, and that omen and that augury were deemed to import that the residence of Terminus must not be changed, and his being the only one of the gods who would not submit to be called forth from the boundaries consecrated to him, denoted that all things there were to stand firm and immovable. After they had received this presage of its perpetual duration, there followed another prodigy, portending the greatness of the empire. A human head, with the face entire, is said to have appeared to those who were opening the foundation of the temple, which appearance denoted, without the help of any far-fetched illusion, that this would be the metropolis of the empire and the head of the world. Such was the interpretation given of it by the soothsayers, both those who were in the city and others whom they sent for from Etruria to hold a consultation on the subject. This encouraged the king to enlarge the expense, so that the spoils of Pometia, which, according to his first design, were to have completed the edifice, were scarcely sufficient for the foundations. For this reason, besides his being the more ancient writer, I should rather believe Fabius that these amounted to no more than 40 talents, than Piso, who wrote that 40,000 pounds weight of silver were set apart for that purpose, a sum of money that could not be expected out of the spoil of any one city in that age, and which must have been more than sufficient for laying the foundations even of the most magnificent of our modern structures. Intent on finishing the temple, he sent for workmen from all parts of Etruria, and converted to that use not only the public money, but the public labor. And although this, which was in itself no small hardship, was added to the toils of military service, yet the people murmured the less when they considered that they were employing their hands in erecting temples to the gods. They were afterwards obliged to toil at other works, which, though they made less show, were attended with greater difficulty, the erecting seats in the circus, and conducting underground the principal sewer, the receptacle of all the filth of the city, two works to which the magnificence of modern times can scarcely produce anything equal. After the people had been fatigued by these labours, the king, considering so great a multitude as a burden to the city, where there was not employment for them, and wishing at the same time to extend the frontiers of his dominions by means of colonies, sent a number of colonists to Signia and Circeii to serve as barriers to the city against an enemy, both by land and sea. While he was thus employed, a dreadful prodigy appeared to him. A snake, sliding out of a wooden pillar, terrified the beholders, and made them fly into the palace. This not only struck the king himself with sudden terror, but filled his breast with anxious apprehensions, so that, whereas in the case of public prodigies the Etrurian soothsayers only were applied to, being thoroughly frightened at this domestic apparition, as it were, he resolved to send to Delphi, the most celebrated oracle in the world, and judging it unsafe to entrust the answers which should be given to indifferent persons, he sent his 2 sons into Greece, through lands little known at that time, and seas still more so. Titus and Arens set out, and, as a companion, was sent with them Lucius Junius Brutus, son to Tarquinia, the king's sister, a young man of a capacity widely different from the appearance which he had put on. Having heard that the principal men in the state, and among the rest his brother, had been put to death by his uncle, he resolved that the king should find nothing to dread, either from his manners or his means, and to seek security in contempt. He took care, therefore, to fashion his behaviour to the semblance of foolishness, submitting himself and his fortune to the pleasure and rapacity of the king. Nor did he show any dislike to the surname of Brutus, content that, under the cover of that appellation, the genius which was to be the deliverer of the Roman people should lie concealed, and wait the proper season for exertion. He was, at this time, carried to Delphi by the Tarquinii, rather as a subject of sport than as a companion, and is said to have brought as an offering to Apollo a golden wand enclosed in a staff of cornel wood, hollowed for that purpose, an emblem figurative of the state of his own capacity. When they arrived there, and executed their father's commission, the young man felt a wish to enquire to which of them the kingdom of Rome was to belong, and we are told that these words were uttered from the bottom of the cave: "Young man, whichever of you shall first kiss your mother, he shall possess the sovereign power at Rome." The Tarquinii ordered that this matter should be kept secret with the utmost care, that Sextus, who had been left behind at Rome, might remain ignorant of the answer, so as to have no chance for the kingdom. They themselves had recourse to lots to determine which of them should first kiss their mother on their returning to Rome. Brutus judged that the expression of Apollo had another meaning, and, as if he had accidentally stumbled and fallen, he touched the earth with his lips, considering that she was the common mother of all mankind. On their return from thence to Rome, they found vigorous preparations going on for a war against the Rutulians. Ardea was a city belonging to the Rutulians, a nation, considering the part of the world and the age, remarkably opulent, and this very circumstance gave occasion to the war, for the Roman king was earnestly desirous both of procuring money for himself, his treasury being exhausted by the magnificence of his public works, and also of reconciling, by means of the spoils, the minds of his subjects, who were highly dissatisfied with his government, for, besides other instances of his pride, they thought themselves ill-treated by being engaged for such a length of time in the employments of handicrafts and in labour fit for slaves. An attempt was made to take Ardea by storm, and that not succeeding, he adopted the plan of distressing the enemy by a blockade and works erected round them. In this fixed post, as is generally the case when the operations of war are rather tedious than vigorous, leave of absence was readily granted, and to the principal officers more readily than to the soldiers. The young men of the royal family, in particular, frequently passed their leisure time in feasting and entertainments. It happened that while these were drinking together at the quarters of Sextus Tarquinius, where Collatinus Tarquinius, the son of Egerius, also supped, mention was made of their wives. Each extolled his own to the skies. On this, a dispute arising, Collatinus told them that there was no need of words. It could easily be known in a few hours how much his Lucretia excelled the rest. We are young and strong. Let us mount our horses and inspect in person the behaviour of our wives. That must be the most unexceptionable proof which meets our eyes on the unexpected arrival of the husband. They were heated with wine. Agreed, was the word. At full speed they fly to Rome. Having arrived there at the first dusk of the evening, they proceeded thence to Cloelia, where they found Lucretia, not like the king's daughters-in-law, whom they had seen spending their time in luxurious entertainments among those of their own rank, but busily employed with her wool, though at that late hour, and sitting in the middle of the house, with her maids at work around her. The honour of superiority among the ladies mentioned in the dispute was, of course, acknowledged to belong to Lucretia. Her husband, on his arrival, and the Tarquinii were kindly received, and the husband, exulting in his victory, gave the royal youths a friendly invitation. There Sextus Tarquinius, instigated by brutal lust, formed a design of violating Lucretia's chastity by force, both her beauty and her approved modesty serving as incentives. After this youthful frolic of the night, they returned to the camp. A few days after, Sextus Tarquinius, without the knowledge of Collatinus, went to Cloelia with only a single attendant. He was kindly received by the family, who suspected not his design, and, after supper, conducted to the chamber where guests were lodged. Then, burning with desire, as soon as he thought that everything was safe and the family all at rest, he came with his sword drawn to Lucretia, where she lay asleep, and holding her down, with his left hand pressed on her breast, said, "Lucretia, be silent. I am Sextus Tarquinius. My sword is in my hand. If you utter a word, you die." Terrified at being thus disturbed from sleep, she saw no assistance near, and immediate death threatening her. Tarquinius then acknowledged his passion, entreated, mixed threats with entreaties, and used every argument likely to have effect on a woman's mind. But finding her inflexible and not to be moved even by the fear of death, he added to that fear the dread of dishonour, telling her that after killing her he would murder a slave and lay him naked by her side, that she might be said to have been slain in base adultery. The shocking apprehensions conveyed by this menace overpowering her resolution in defending her chastity, his lust became victorious, and Tarquinius departed, applauding himself for this triumph over a lady's honour. But Lucretia, plunged by such a disaster into the deepest distress, dispatched a messenger to Rome to her father, with orders to proceed to Ardea to her husband, and to desire them to come to her, each with one faithful friend, to tell them that there was a necessity for their doing so, and speedily, for that a dreadful affair had happened. Spurius Lucretius came with Publius Valerius, the son of Volesus, Collatinus with Lucius Junius Brutus, in company with whom he chanced to be returning to Rome, when he was met by his wife's messenger. They found Lucretia sitting in her chamber, melancholy and dejected. On the arrival of her friends she burst into tears, and on her husband's asking, "Is all well?" "Far from it," said she, "for how can it be well with a woman who has lost her chastity? Collatinus, the impression of another man is in your bed. Yet my person only has been violated. My mind is guiltless, as my death will testify. But give me your right hands, and pledge your honour that the adulterer shall not escape unpunished. He is Sextus Tarquinius, who, under the appearance of a guest, disguising as an enemy, obtained here last night, by armed violence, a triumph deadly to me, and to himself also, if ye be men." They all pledged their honour, one after another, and endeavoured to comfort her distracted mind, acquitting her of blame, as under the compulsion of force, and charging it on the violent perpetrator of the crime, told her that the mind alone was capable of sinning, not the body, and that where there was no such intention, there could be no guilt. "It is your concern," said she, "to consider what is due to him. As to me, though I acquit myself of the guilt, I cannot dispense with the penalty, nor shall any woman ever plead the example of Lucretia for surviving her chastity." Thus saying, she plunged into her heart a knife which she had concealed under her garment, and falling forward on the wound, dropped lifeless. The husband and father shrieked aloud. But Brutus, while they were overpowered by grief, drawing the knife from the wound of Lucretia, and holding it out, reeking with blood before him, said, "By this blood, most chaste until injured by royal insolence, I swear, and call you, O ye gods, to witness, that I will prosecute to destruction, by sword, fire, and every forcible means in my power, both Lucius Tarquinius the proud and his impious wife, together with their entire race, and never will suffer one of them, nor any other person whatsoever, to be king in Rome." He then delivered the knife to Collatinus, afterwards to Lucretius and Valerius, who were filled with amazement, as at a prodigy, and at a loss to account for this unusual elevation of sentiment in the mind of Brutus. However, they took the oath as directed, and converting their grief into rage, followed Brutus, who put himself at their head and called on them to proceed instantly to abolish kingly power. They brought out the body of Lucretia from the house, conveyed it to the forum, and assembled the people, who came together quickly in astonishment, as may be supposed, at a deed so atrocious and unheard of. Every one exclaimed with vehemence against the villainy and violence of the prince. They were deeply affected by the grief of her father, and also by the discourse of Brutus, who rebuked their tears and ineffectual complaints, and advised them, as became men, as became Romans, to take up arms against those who had dared to treat them as enemies. The most spirited among the youth offered themselves with their arms, and the rest followed their example. On which, leaving half their number at the gates to defend Cloelia, and fixing guards to prevent any intelligence of the commotion being carried to the princes, the rest, with Brutus at their head, marched to Rome. When they arrived there, the sight of such an armed multitude spread terror and confusion wherever they came. But in a little time, when people observed the principal men of the state marching at their head, they concluded that whatever the matter was, there must be good reason for it. Nor did the heinousness of the affair raise less violent emotions in the minds of the people at Rome than it had at Cloelia, so that from all parts of the city they hurried into the forum, where, as soon as the party arrived, a crier summoned the people to attend the tribune of the Celeres, which office happened at that time to be held by Brutus. He there made a speech, no way consonant to that low degree of sensibility and capacity which until that day he had counterfeited, recounting the violence and lust of Sextus Tarquinius, the shocking violation of Lucretia's chastity and her lamentable death, the misfortune of Tricipitinus in being left childless, who must feel the cause of his daughter's death as a greater injury and cruelty than her death itself. To these representations he added the pride of the king himself, the miseries and toils of the commons, buried underground to clean sinks and sewers, saying that the citizens of Rome, the conquerors of all the neighboring nations, were, from warriors, reduced to laborers and stone-cutters. Mentioned the barbarous murder of King Servius Tullius, his abominable daughter driving in her carriage over the body of her father, and invoked the gods to avenge the cause of parents. By descanting on these and other, I suppose, more forcible topics, which the heinousness of present injuries suggests at the time, but which it is difficult for writers to repeat, he inflamed the rage of the multitude to such a degree that they were easily persuaded to deprive the king of his government, and to pass an order for the banishment of Lucius Tarquinius, his wife and children. Brutus himself, having collected and armed such of the young men as voluntarily gave in their names, set out for the camp at Ardea, in order to excite the troops there to take part against the king. The command in the city he left to Lucretius, who had some time before been appointed by the king to the office of prefect of the city. During this tumult, Tullia fled from her house, both men and women, wherever she passed, imprecating curses on her head and invoking the Furies, the avengers of parents. News of these proceedings having reached the camp, and the king, alarmed at such extraordinary events, having begun his march towards Rome to suppress the commotions, Brutus, informed of his approach, turned into another road in order to avoid a meeting, and very nearly at the same time, by different roads, Brutus arrived at Ardea and Tarquinius at Rome. Tarquinius found the gates shut against him and an order of banishment pronounced. The deliverer of the city was received in the camp with joy, and the king's sons were driven thence with disgrace. 2 of these followed their father and went into exile at Cere among the Etruscans. Sextus Tarquinius, having retired to Gabii as if to his own dominions, was slain by some persons who were glad of an opportunity of gratifying old animosities which he had excited there by his rapine and murders. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus reigned 25 years. The government of kings continued from the building of the city to the establishment of its liberty 244 years. After that, in an assembly of the centuries held by the prefect of the city, were elected, conformably to a plan found in the commentaries of Servius Tullius, 2 magistrates called consuls. These were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. End of Book 1, Part 9.
Part 1, Book 2 of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius, translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 1. Henceforward I am to treat of the affairs, civil and military, of a free people, for such the Romans were now become, of annual magistrates, and the authority of the laws, exalted above that of men. What greatly enhanced the public joy on having obtained to this state of freedom was the haughty insolence of the late king, for the former kings governed in such a manner that all of them in succession might deservedly be reckoned as founders of the several parts at least of the city, which they added to it, to accommodate the great numbers of inhabitants, whom they themselves introduced. Nor can it be doubted that the same Brutus, who justly merited so great glory for having expelled that haughty king, would have hurt the public interest most materially had he, through an over-hasty zeal for liberty, wrested the government from any one of the former princes. For what must have been the consequence, if that rabble of shepherds and vagabonds, fugitives from their own countries, having, under the sanction of an inviolable asylum, obtained liberty, or at least impunity, and, uncontrolled by the dread of kingly power, had once been set in commotion by tribunitian storms, and had, in a city where they were strangers, engaged in contest with the patricians, before the pledges of wives and children, and an affection for the soil itself, which in length of time is acquired from habit, and had united their minds in social concord. The state, as yet but a tender shoot, had in that case been torn to pieces by discord, whereas the tranquil moderation of the then government cherished it, and by due nourishment brought it forward to such a condition that its powers being ripened, it was capable of producing the glorious fruits of liberty. The origin of liberty is to be dated from that period, rather on account of the consular government being limited to 1 year, than of any diminution made of the power which had been possessed by the kings. The first consuls enjoyed all their privileges, and all their ensigns of authority. In this respect only care was taken, not to double the objects of terror by giving the fasces to both of the consuls. Brutus, with the consent of his colleague, was first honoured with the fasces, and the zeal which he had shown as the champion of liberty in rescuing it from oppression was not greater than that which he afterwards displayed in the character of its guardian. First of all, while the people were in raptures at their new acquisition of freedom, lest they might afterwards be perverted by the importunities or presents of the princes, he bound them by an oath that they would never suffer any man to assume the authority of king at Rome. Next, in order that the fullness of their body might give the greater weight to the Senate, he filled up the numbers of the senators, which had been diminished by the king's murders, to the amount of 300, electing to that body the principal men of equestrian rank, and hence the practice is said to have taken its rise of summoning to the Senate those who are fathers, and those who are conscripti, for they called those who were elected into this new Senate conscripti. This had a wonderful effect towards producing concord in the Senate, and in attaching the affection of the commons to the patricians. People then turned their attention to matters of religion, and because some public religious rites had usually been performed by the kings in person, in order that these should be no want of one in any occasion, they appointed a king of the sacrifices. This office they made subject to the jurisdiction of the pontiff, fearing lest honor, being joined to the title, might in some shape be injurious to liberty, which was then the first object of their concern. I know not whether they did not carry to excess their great anxiety to raise bulwarks to it on all sides, even in points of the most trivial consequence. For the name of one of the consuls, though there was no other cause of dislike, became a subject of jealousy to the people. It was alleged the Tarquinii had been too long accustomed to the possession of sovereign power. Priscus first began, next indeed reigned Servilius Tullius. Yet though that interruption occurred, Tarquinius Superbus never lost sight of the crown, so as to consider it the right of another, but by violence and by flagitious means reclaimed it, as the inheritance of his family. Now that Superbus had been expelled, the government was in the hands of Collatinus. The Tarquinii knew not how to live in a private station. The very name itself was displeasing and dangerous to liberty. These discourses were at first gradually circulated through every part of the city, for the purpose of trying the disposition of the people. After the suspicions of the commons had, by these suggestions, been sufficiently excited, Brutus called them together. When they were assembled, after first reciting the oath which the people had taken, that they would never suffer a king at Rome, or anything else that might be dangerous to liberty, he told them that they must support this resolution with their utmost power, and that no circumstance of any tendency that way ought to be overlooked; that from his regard to the person alluded to, he mentioned the matter unwillingly, nor would he have mentioned it at all, did not his affection for the commonwealth outweigh all other considerations. The Roman people did not think that they had recovered entire freedom. The regal family, the regal name remained, not only in the city, but in the government. This was a circumstance not merely unpropitious, but dangerous to liberty. Do you, Lucius Tarquinius, of your own accord, remove from us this apprehension? We remember, we acknowledge that you expelled the princes. Complete your kindness. Carry hence your name. Your countrymen, on my recommendation, will not give you up your property, but if you have occasion for more, will make liberal additions to it. Depart in friendship. Deliver the state from this, it may be groundless, apprehension. But the opinion is deeply rooted in their minds that only with the race of the Tarquinii will kingly power depart hence. Astonishment at this extraordinary and unexpected affair at first deprived the consul of all power of utterance, and when he afterwards began to speak, the principal men of the state gathered round him, and with earnest importunity urged the same request. Others affected him less, but when Spurius Lucretius, his superior in age and dignity of character, and his father-in-law besides, began to try every method of persuasion, using by turns arguments and entreaties, that he would suffer himself to be overcome by the general sense of his countrymen, the consul, fearing lest hereafter, when he should have returned to a private station, the same measures might be used against him, with the additional, perhaps, of the confiscation of his property and other marks of ignominy, resigned the office of consul, and removing all his effects to Lavinium, withdrew from the territories of the state. Brutus, in pursuance of a decree of the Senate, proposed to the people that all who were of the Tarquinian family should be banished, and in an assembly of the centuries he elected for his colleague Publius Valerius, who had been his assistant in expelling the royal family. No person now doubted but war would be immediately commenced by the Tarquinii. That event, however, did not take place as soon as was expected. But, what they entertained no apprehension of, liberty was very near being lost, by secret machinations and treachery. There were, among the Romans, several young men of no inconsiderable families, who during the reign of the king had indulged their pleasures too freely, and being of the same age, and constant companions of the younger Tarquinii, had been accustomed to live in a princely style. The privileges of all ranks being now reduced to one level, these grew uneasy at the restraint hereby laid on their irregularities, and complained heavily among themselves that the liberty of others had imposed slavery on them. A king was a human being; from him a request might be obtained, whether right or wrong. With him there was room for favor and for acts of kindness. He could be angry, and he could forgive. He knew a distinction between a friend and an enemy. But the law was a deaf, inexorable being, circulated rather for the safety and advantage of the poor than of the rich, and admitted of no relaxation or indulgence if its bounds were transgressed. Men being liable to so many mistakes, to have no other security but innocence is a hazardous situation. While their minds were in this discontented state, ambassadors arrived from the Tarquinii, who, without any mention of their restoration, demanded only their effects. The Senate, having granted them an audience, continued their deliberations on the subject for several days, being apprehensive that a refusal to give them up would afford a plausible reason for a war, and the giving them up a fund in aid of it. Meanwhile the ambassadors were busily employed in schemes of another nature. Whilst they openly demanded the effects, they were secretly forming a plan for recovering the throne, and addressing themselves to the young nobles, seemingly on the business which they were supposed to have in charge, they made trial of their dispositions. To those who lent an ear to their suggestions, they delivered letters from the Tarquinii, and concerted measures with them for receiving those princes privately into the city by night. The business was first entrusted to the brothers of the name Vitellii, and those of the name Aquilii. A sister of the Vitellii had been married to the consul Brutus, and there were two sons of that marriage now grown up, Titus and Tiberius. These were led in by their uncles to take part in the design, and several others of the young nobility were drawn into the conspiracy, whose names, at this distance of time, are unknown. In the meanwhile, the opinion of those who advised the giving up of the property having prevailed in the Senate, this afforded the ambassadors a pretext for remaining in the city, because they had been allowed time by the consuls to procure carriages for the conveyance of the effects of the princes, all which time they spent in consultations with the conspirators, and had, by pressing instances, prevailed upon them to send letters for the Tarquinii. For, without these, how could they be so fully assured, as an affair of that high importance required, that the report of the ambassadors were not groundless? These letters, given as a pledge of their sincerity, proved the means of detecting the plot. For the day before that on which they were to return to the Tarquinii, the ambassadors happening to sup with the Vitellii, and the conspirators having here in private had much conversation, as was natural, on the subject of their new enterprise, their discourse was overheard by one of the slaves, who had before this discovered that such a design was in agitation, but waited for this opportunity until the letters should be given to the ambassadors, because these, being seized, would furnish full proof of the transaction. As soon as he found that they were delivered, he made a discovery of the affair to the consuls. The consuls, setting from home directly, and apprehending the ambassadors and conspirators in the fact, effectually crushed the affair without any tumult, taking particular care, with regard to the letters, that they should not escape them. They instantly threw the traitors into chains, but hesitated for some time with regard to proceeding against the ambassadors, and though by their behavior they had deserved to be treated as enemies, yet regard to the law of nations prevailed. With respect to the effects of the princes, which they had before ordered to be restored, the business was now laid before the Senate for reconsideration, and they, actuated entirely by resentment, decreed that they should not be restored, but converted to the use of the state. They were, therefore, given up to the commons as plunder, with the intent that these, after such an act of violence against the princes as the seizing of their effects, might for ever lose all hope of reconciliation with them. The land of the Tarquinii, which lay between the city and the Tiber, being consecrated to the god of war, has from that time been called the Field of Mars. It happened that there was then on that ground a crop of corn, ripe for the sickle, and because it would be an impiety to make use of this produce of the field, a great number of men were set in at once, who, having cut it down, carried it in baskets, and threw it, grain and straw together, into the Tiber, whose waters were low at that time, as is generally the case in the middle of summer. The heaps of corn then being frequently stopped for a while in the shallows, and having contracted a covering of mud, sunk and remained fixed, and by this means the afflux of other materials from which stream is apt to carry down, an island was gradually formed. I suppose that mounds were added afterwards, and assistance given by art to raise the surface to its present height, and give it sufficient firmness to support temples and porticos. After the people had made plunder of the effects of the princes, the traitors were condemned and executed, and the execution was the more remarkable on this account, that his office of consul imposed on a father the severe duty of inflicting punishment on his own sons, and that he, who ought not to have been present as a spectator, was yet the very person whom fortune pitched on to exact the penalty of their offense. The youths, all of the first distinction, stood tied to stakes, but the sons of the consul entirely engaged the eyes of the spectators, as if the others were persons unknown, and people felt compassion, not only for their punishment, but even for the crime by which they had brought it on themselves. To think that they could, during that year particularly, have been induced to entertain a design of betraying their country, just delivered from tyranny, their father its deliverer, the consulship, which had commenced in the Junian family, the patricians, commons, in a word, whatever Rome held in its highest veneration, into the hands of one who was formerly a tyrannical king, now an enraged exile. The consuls mounted their throne, and the lictors were sent to inflict the punishment. After stripping the criminals naked, they beat them with rods, and beheaded them, whilst, through the whole process of the affair, the looks and countenance of Brutus afforded an extraordinary spectacle, the feelings of the father often struggling with the character of the magistrate enforcing the execution of the laws. Justice done to the offenders, in order to exhibit a striking example for the prevention of crimes, in their treatment of the several parties, they gave, as a reward to the discoverer of the treason, a sum of money out of the treasury, his freedom, and the rights of a citizen. This man is said to have been made free by the vindicta. Some think that the term vindicta was taken from him, his name having been Vindictius. After him it obtained as a rule that whoever was made free in that manner should be considered and admitted a citizen. Tarquinius, on being informed of these transactions, became inflamed, not only with grief for the disappointment of such promising hopes, but with hatred and resentment, and finding every path shut against secret plots, determined to have recourse to open war, and to that end he went round to all the cities of Etruria, in the character of a suppliant, addressing himself particularly to the people of Veii and Tarquinii, entreating them not to suffer him who was sprung from themselves and of the same blood, who was lately possessed of so great a kingdom, now exiled and in want, to perish before their eyes, together with the young men his sons. Others had been invited from foreign countries to Rome to fill the throne, but he, when in possession of the government, and while he was employing its arms in extending the limits of the Roman Empire, was expelled by a villainous conspiracy of men who were most closely connected with him, who, because no one of their number was qualified to hold the reins of government, had forcibly shared the several parts of it among them, and had given up his property to be plundered by the populace, to the intent that all might be equally guilty. He only wished to be restored to his own country and crown, and to be avenged on his ungrateful subjects. He besought them to support and assist him, and at the same time to take revenge for the injuries which they themselves had sustained of old, for their legions so often slaughtered and their lands taken from them. These arguments had the desired effect on the Veientians, every one of whom earnestly and with menaces declared that ought now at least, with a Roman at their head, to efface the memory of their disgraces and recover by arms what had been lost. The people of Tarquinii was moved by his name and his relation to themselves. They thought it redounded to their honor that their countrymen should reign at Rome. Thus 2 armies of 2 states followed Tarquinius to demand his restoration and to prosecute war against the Romans. When they advanced into the Roman territories, the consuls marched out to meet the enemy. Valerius led the infantry in order of battle. Brutus with the cavalry marched at some distance from them in order to procure intelligence. In like manner the vanguard of the enemy was composed of cavalry, under the command of Aruns Tarquinius, the king's son. The king himself followed with the legions. Aruns, perceiving at a distance, by the lictors, that a consul was there, and afterwards on a nearer approach plainly distinguished Brutus by his face, became inflamed with rage, and cried out, "That is the man who has driven us as exiles from our country. See how he marches in state, decorated with our ensigns. Ye gods, avengers of kings, assist me." He then spurred on his horse, and drove furiously against the consul. Brutus perceived that the attack was meant for him, and as it was at that time reckoned not improper for generals themselves to engage in fight, he eagerly offered himself to the combat, and they advanced against each other with such furious animosity, neither thinking of guarding his own person, but solely intent on wounding his enemy, that, in the violence of the conflict, each of them received his antagonist's spear in his body, through his buckler, and being entangled together by the 2 spears, they both fell lifeless from their horses. At the same time the rest of the cavalry began to engage, and were shortly afterwards joined by the infantry. A battle then ensued, in which victory seemed alternately to incline to either party, the advantages being nearly equal, for the right wings of both armies got the better, and the left were worsted. At length the Veientians, accustomed to be vanquished by the Roman troops, were routed and dispersed. The Tarquinians, a new enemy, not only kept their ground, but even on their side made the Romans give way. End of Book 2, Part 1. Book 2, Part 2 of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius, translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 2. Though such was the issue of the battle, yet so great terror took possession of the Tarquinius and the Etrurians that, giving up the exercises impracticable, both armies, the Veientian and Tarquinian, retired by night to their respective countries. To the accounts of this battle writers have added miracles, that, during the silence of the following night, a loud voice was uttered from the Arsian wood, which was believed to be the voice of Silvanus, in these words: "The number of the Etrurians who fell in the engagement was greater by 1. The Romans have the victory." The Romans certainly departed from the field as conquerors, the Etrurians as vanquished, for when the day appeared, not one of the enemy was to be seen. The consul Publius Valerius collected the spoils, and returned in triumph to Rome. He celebrated the funeral of his colleague with the utmost degree of magnificence which those times could afford, but a much higher mark of honor to the deceased was the grief expressed by the public, singularly remarkable in this particular, that the matrons mourned for him as a parent during the whole year, in gratitude for his vigorous exertions in avenging the cause of violated chastity. In a little time, the consul who survived (so changeable are the minds of the populace) from having enjoyed a high degree of popularity, became an object not only of jealousy but of suspicion, attended with the charge of an atrocious nature. It was given out that he aspired to the sovereignty, because he had not submitted a colleague in the room of Brutus, and besides was building a house on the summit of Mount Walia, which in such a lofty and strong situation would be an impregnable fortress. The consul's mind was deeply affected with concern and indignation, finding that such reports were circulated and believed. He therefore summoned the people to an assembly, and, ordering the fasces to be lowered, mounted the rostrum. It was a sight highly pleasing to the multitude to find the ensigns of sovereignty lowered to them, and an acknowledgment thus openly given that the majesty and power of the people were superior to those of the consul. Attention being ordered, the consul exalted the good fortune of his colleague, who, after having accomplished the deliverance of his country and being raised to the highest post of honor, met with death while fighting in defense of the republic, when his glory had arrived at full maturity, without having excited jealousy, whereas he himself, surviving his glory, was become an object of calumny, and from the character of deliverer of his country had sunk to a level with the Aquilii and Vitellii. Will no degree of merit then, said he, ever gain your confidence, so far as to be secure from the attacks of suspicion? Could I have the least apprehension that I, the bitterest enemy to kings, should undergo the charge of aiming at kingly power? Supposing that I dwelt in the very citadel and in the capital, could I believe that I was an object of terror to my countrymen? Does my reputation among you depend on so mere a trifle? Is my title to your confidence so slightly founded, that it is more to be considered where I am than what I am? Citizens, the house of Publius Valerius shall be no obstruction to your freedom. The Waelian Mount shall be secure to you. I will not only bring down my house to the plain, but will fix it under the hill, that your dwellings may overlook that of your suspected countryman. Let those build on the Waelian Mount to whom ye can better entrust your liberty than to Publius Valerius. Immediately all the material were brought down from the Waelian Mount, and the house was built at the foot of the hill, where the Temple of Victory now stands. Some laws were then proposed by the consul, which not only cleared him from all suspicion of a design to possess himself of regal power, but whose tendency was so contrary thereto, that they even rendered him popular, and from thence he acquired the surname of Publicola. Such particularly was that concerning an appeal to the people against the decrees of the magistrates, and that which devoted both the persons and the goods of any who should form a design of assuming regal power. These laws were highly acceptable to the populace, and having effected the ratification of them, while alone in office, in order that the credit of them might be entirely his own, he then held an assembly for the election of a new colleague. The consul was Spurius Lucretius, who, being far advanced in years, was too feeble to support the duties of his office, died in a few days after. Marcus Horatius Puvillus was substituted in the room of Lucretius. In some old writers I find no mention of Lucretius as consul. They place Horatius as immediate successor to Brutus. I supposed he was not taken notice of, because his consulate was not signalized by any important transaction. The temple of Jupiter in the Capitol had not yet been dedicated. The consuls Valerius and Horatius cast lots which should perform the dedication, and it fell to Horatius. Publicola set out to conduct the war against the Venantians. The friends of Valerius showed more displeasure than the occasion merited, at the dedication of a temple so celebrated being given to Horatius. Having endeavored by every means to prevent its taking place, and all their attempts having failed of success, when the consul had already laid his hands on the doorpost, and was employed in offering prayers to the gods, they hastily addressed him with the shocking intelligence that his son was dead, and insisted that his family being thus defiled, he could not dedicate the temple. Whether he doubted the truth of the intelligence, or whether it was owing to great firmness of mind, we are not informed with certainty, nor is it easy to conjecture, but he was no further diverted from the business he was engaged in by that information than just to give orders that the body should be buried, and, still holding the post, he finished his prayer, and dedicated the temple. Such were the transactions at home and abroad, which occurred during the first year after the expulsion of the royal family. The next consuls appointed were Publius Valerius a second time, and Titus Lucretius. Meanwhile the Tarquinii had carried their complaints to Lars Porsena, king of Clusium, and there, mixing admonitions with entreaties, they at one time besought him that he would not suffer those, who derived their origin from Etruria and were of the same blood and name, to spend their lives in poverty and exile; then warned him not to let this new practice of dethroning kings proceed without chastisement, adding that liberty had in itself sufficient sweets to allure others to follow the example, unless kings would show the same degree of vigor in support of kingly power which the people exerted to wrest it from them. The highest ranks would be reduced to a level with the lowest. There would be no dignity, no preeminence, among the several members of society. There would soon be an end to regal authority, which among the gods and men had heretofore been held in the highest degree of estimation. Porsena, considering it as highly conducive to the honor of Etruria that there should be a king at Rome, and also that that king should be of the Etrurian race, led an army to Rome, determined to support his pretensions by force of arms. Never on any former occasion were the Senate struck with such terror, so powerful was the state of Clusium at that time, and so great the name of Porsena. Nor were they in dread of the enemies only, but also of their own countrymen, lest the Roman populace, overcome by their fears, might admit the kings into the city, and for the sake of peace submit to slavery. The Senate, therefore, as this season practiced many conciliatory measures toward the commons. The first care was applied to the markets, and people were sent, some to the Voloscians, others to Cumae, to purchase corn. The privilege also of selling salt, because the price had been raised to an extravagant height, was taken out of the hands of private persons, and placed entirely under the management of government. The commons were also exempted from port duties and taxes, that the public expenses might fall upon the rich, who were equal to the burden, the poor paying tax sufficient if they educated their children. This indulgent care preserved such harmony in the state, even during the people's severe sufferings afterwards from siege and famine, that the name of king was abhorred by all, nor did any single person, in after times, ever acquire such a high degree of popularity by artful intrigues as the whole Senate then obtained by their wise administration. As the enemy drew nigh, everyone removed hastily from the country into the city, on every side of which strong guards were posted. Some parts seemed well secured by the walls, others by the Tiber running close to them. The Sublician bridge was very near affording the enemy an entrance. Had it not been for one man, Horatius Cocles, no other bulwark had the fortune of Rome on that day. He happened to be posted on guard at the bridge, and when he saw the Janiculum taken by a sudden assault, and the enemy pouring down from thence in full speed, his countrymen in disorder and confusion, no longer attempting opposition, but quitting their ranks, he caught hold of every one that he could, and appealing to gods and men, assured them that it was in vain that they fled, after deserting the post that could protect them; that if they passed the bridge and left it behind them, they would see greater numbers of the enemy in the Palatium and the Capitol than in the Janiculum. Wherefore he advised them and warned them to break down the bridge by their swords, fire, or any other effectual means, while he should sustain the attack of the enemy, as long as it was possible for one person to withstand them. He then advanced to the first entrance of the bridge, and being easily distinguished from those who showed their backs in retreating from the fight, by his facing to the front, with his arms prepared for action, he astonished the enemy by such wonderful intrepidity. Shame, however, prevailed on two to remain with him, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius. both of them men of distinguished families and characters. With their assistance he, for a time, supported the first storm, and the most furious part of the fight. Even these he sent back, when the bridge was nearly destroyed, and those who were employed in breaking it down called upon them to retire. Then, darting fierce, menacing looks at each of the leaders of the Etrurians, he sometimes challenged them singly, sometimes upbraided them together, as slaves of haughty kings, who were incapable of relishing liberty themselves, had come to wrest it from others. For a considerable time they hesitated, looking about for some other to begin the combat. Shame at length put their troops in motion, and setting up a shout, they poured their javelins from all sides against their single opponent. All which, having struck in the shield with which he guarded himself, he was still persisting with the same undaunted resolution, and with haughty strides to keep possession of his post. They had now resolved, by making a violent push, to force him from it, when the crash of the falling bridge, and at the same time a shout raised by the Romans for joy at having completed their purpose, filled them with sudden dismay, and stopped them from proceeding in the attempt. Then Cocles said, "Holy father Tiberranus, I beseech thee to receive these arms and this thy soldier into thy propitious stream." With these words, armed as he was, he leaped down into the Tiber, and through showers of darts which fell around him, swam safe across to his friends, having exhibited a degree of intrepidity which in after times was more generally celebrated than believed. The state showed a grateful sense of such high desert. A statue was erected to him in the Comitium, with a grant of land as large as he could plough completely in one day. The zeal of private persons too was conspicuous, amidst the honours conferred on him by the public, for great as the scarcity then was, everyone contributed something to him, in proportion to the stock of their family, abridging themselves of their own proper support. Porsena, disappointed of success in this first effort, changed his plan from assault to a blockade, and leaving a force sufficient to secure the Janiculum, encamped his main body in the plain along the bank of the Tiber, at the same time collecting ships from all quarters, at once to guard the passage, that no corn should be conveyed to Rome, and to enable his troops to cross over the river in different places, as occasion offered, to lay waste the country. In a short time he extended his depredations so successfully through every part of the Roman territories that people were obliged to convey their effects into the city, as also their cattle, which no one would venture to drive within the gates. The Etrurians were permitted to act in this uncontrolled manner, not so much through fear as design, for Valerius the consul, intent on gaining an opportunity of making an unexpected attack on a large number of them, at a time when they were unprepared, overlooked trifling advantages, reserved his force for a severe revenge on a more important occasion. With this view, in order to allure the plunderers, he gave orders to his men to drive out some cattle through the Esquiline gate, which was at the opposite side from the enemy, judging that these would soon get information of it, because during the blockade and the scarcity of provisions, many of the slaves turned traitors and deserted. Accordingly, they were informed of it by a deserter, and passed over the river in much greater numbers than usual, in hopes of gaining possession of the entire booty. Publius Valerius then ordered Titus Herminius, with a small body of men, to lie concealed near the 2-mile stone on the Gabian road; Spurius Lartius, with a body of light armed troops, to stand at the Colline gate until the enemy should pass by, and then to take post in their rear, so as to cut off their retreat to the river. The other consul, Titus Lucretius, with some companies of foot, marched out of the Nivian gate. Valerius himself led down his chosen cohorts from the Coelian mount, and these were the first who were observed by the enemy. Herminius, as soon as he found that the alarm was taken, rushed out from his ambush to take his share in the fray, and while the Etrurians were busied in forming an opposition to Valerius, fell upon their rear. The shout was returned, both from the right and the left, from the Colline gate on the one hand, and the Nivian on the other. The plunderers being thus surrounded, destitute of strength to make head against their adversaries, and shut out from all possibilities of a retreat, were cut to pieces. After this the Etrurians confined their ravages to narrower limits. The siege continued notwithstanding, and provisions becoming exceedingly scarce and dear, Porsena entertained hopes that, by remaining quiet in his present position, he should become master of the city, when Gaius Mutius, a noble youth, filled with indignation on reflecting that the Roman people, while they were in bondage under their kings, were never in any war besieged by any enemy, and that the same people, now in a state of freedom, were held besieged by those very Etrurians whose armies they had often routed, resolved, therefore, by some great and daring effort, to remove much reproach. At first he designed to make his way into the enemy's camp, without communicating his intention, but afterward, dreading lest, if he should go without the order of the consuls and the knowledge of any, he might be apprehended by the Roman guards and brought back as a deserter, an imputation for which the present circumstances of the city would afford plausible grounds, he applied to the Senate and told them, "Fathers, I intend to cross the Tiber, and to enter, if I can, the enemy's camp, not to seek for plunder, or to revenge their depredations in kind. The blow which I meditate, with the aid of the gods, is of more importance." The Senate gave their approbation, and he set out with a sword concealed under his garment. When he came into the camp, he took his place close to the king's tribunal, where a very great crowd was assembled. It happened that, at this time, the soldiers were receiving their pay, and a secretary sitting beside the king, and dressed nearly in the same manner, acted a principal part in the business, and to him the soldiers generally addressed themselves. Mutius, not daring to inquire which was Porsena, lest his not knowing the king should discover what he was, fortune blindly directing the stroke where it was not intended, slew the secretary instead of the king. Then, endeavoring to make his escape through a passage, which with his bloody weapon he cleared for himself among the dismayed crowd, a concourse of soldiers being attracted by the noise, he was seized by the king's life guards, and dragged back. Standing there, single, among a crowd of enemies and before the king's tribunal, even in this situation, in the midst of fortune's severest threats, showed himself more capable of inspiring terror than of feeling it, he spoke to this effect: "I am a Roman citizen. My name is Gaius Mutius. As an enemy, I intended to have slain an enemy, nor is my resolution less firmly prepared to suffer death than to inflict it. It is the part of a Roman both to act and to suffer with fortitude. Nor am I the only one who has harbored such designs against you. There is a long list after me of candidates for the same glorious distinction. Prepare, therefore, if you choose, for a contest of this sort, wherein you must every hour engage at the hazard of your life, and have the enemy and the sword continually in the porch of your pavilion. This is the kind of war in which we, Roman youths, engage against you. Fear not an army in the field, nor in battle. The affair will rest between your single person and each of us separately." The king, inflamed with rage, and at the same time terrified at the danger, ordered fires to be kindled round him, threatening him with severe punishment unless he instantly explained what these plots were, with which he had threatened him in those ambiguous expressions. "Behold," said Mutius, "and perceive what little account is made of the body by those who have in view the attainment of great glory." And thrusting his right hand into a chafing dish of coals which had been kindled for the purpose of a sacrifice, held it there to burn, as if he were void of all sense of feeling. On which the king, thunderstruck in a manner by such astonishing behavior, leapt from his seat, ordered the youth to be removed from the altars, and said to him, "Retire in safety, for the treatment which you intended for me was mild in comparison with that you have practised on yourself. I should wish to increase in success to your bravery, if that bravery were exerted on the side of my own country. However, I dismissed you untouched and unhurt, and discharged you from the penalties, which, by the laws of war, I might inflict." Mutius then, as if to make a return for this act of favor, told him, "Since I find you disposed to honor bravery, that you may obtain from me by kindness what you cannot by threats, know that 300 of us, the principal youths in Rome, have bound ourselves to each other by an oath to attack you in this manner. My lot happened to be the first. The others will be with you, each in his turn, according as the lot shall set him foremost, until fortune shall afford an opportunity of succeeding against you. End of Book 2, Part 2. Part 3, Book 2 of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is the Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius, translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 3. Mutius, who afterwards got the name of Scaevola, or the left-handed, from the loss of his right hand, being thus dismissed, was followed to Rome by ambassadors from Porsena. The king had been so deeply affected by the danger to which he had been exposed in the first attempt, from which nothing had protected him but the mistake of the assailant, and by the consideration that he was to undergo the same hazard as many times as the number of the other conspirators amounted to, that he thought proper, of his own accord, to offer terms of accommodation to the Romans. During the negotiation mention was made to no purpose of the restoration of the Tarquinian family to the throne, and this proposal he made rather because he had not been able to refuse it to the Tarquinii than from entertaining the slightest expectation of its being accepted by the Romans. He carried the point respecting the giving up of the lands taken from the Veientians, and compelled the Romans to submit to give hostages if they wished to see his forces withdrawn from the Janiculum. Peace being concluded on these terms, Porsena withdrew his troops from the Janiculum, and retired out of the Roman territories. To Gaius Mutius, as reward for his valor, the Senate gave a tract of land on either side of the Tiber, which was afterwards called the Mucian Meadows. Such honor being paid to his courage, excited even the other sex to merit public distinctions. A young lady called Cloelia, one of the hostages, the camp of the Etrurians happened to be pitched at a small distance from the banks of the Tiber, evaded the vigilance of the guards, and at the head of a band of her companions swam across the Tiber, threw a shower of darts discharged at them by the enemy, and restored them all in safety to their friends at Rome. When the king was informed of this, being at first highly incensed, he sent envoys to Rome to insist on the restoration of the hostage Cloelia. As to the rest, he showed little concern. But his anger in a little time being converted into admiration, he spoke of her exploit as superior to those of Cocles and Mutius, and declared that as, in the case the hostage should not be given up, he would consider the treaty as broken off. So, if she should be surrendered, he would send her back to her friends in safety. Both parties behaved with honor. The Romans, on their side, returned the pledge of peace, agreeably to the treaty, and with the Etrurian king, merit found, not security only, but honors. After bestowing high compliments on the lady, he told her that he made her a present of half the hostages, with full liberty to choose such as she liked. When they were all drawn out before her, she is said to have chosen the very young boys, which was not only consonant to maiden delicacy, but, in the universal opinion of the hostages themselves, highly reasonable that those who were of such an age as was most liable to injury should in preference be delivered out of the hands of the enemies. Peace being thus re-established, the Romans rewarded this instance of intrepidity so uncommon in the female sex with a mark of honor as uncommon, an equestrian statue. This was erected at the head of the sacred street. Very inconsistent with this peaceful manner in which the Etrurian king retired from the city is the practice handed down from early times, and continued among other customary usages even in our own days, of proclaiming at public sales that they are selling the goods of King Porsena, which custom must necessarily either have taken its rise originally during the war, or it must be derived from a milder source than seems to belong to the expression, which intimates that the goods for sale were taken from an enemy. Of the several accounts which have been given, this seems to be the nearest to the truth, that Porsena, on retiring from the Janiculum, made a present to the Romans of his camp, which was plentifully stored with provisions collected from the neighbouring fertile lands of Etruria, the city at that time labouring under a scarcity, in consequence of the long siege, and lest the populace, if permitted, might seize on them as the spoil of an enemy, they were set up to sale, and called the goods of Porsena, the appellation denoting rather gratitude for the gift than an auction of the king's property, which besides never came into the power of the Romans. After he had put an end to the war with Rome, Porsena, that he might not appear to have led his troops into those countries to no purpose, sent his son Aruns with half of his forces to lay siege to Aricia. The unexpectedness of the attack struck the Aricians at first with dismay, but afterwards, having collected aid both from the Latine states and from Cumae, they assumed such confidence as to venture an engagement in the field. At the beginning of the battle the Etrurians rushed on so furiously that at the very onset they put the Aricians to the rout. The cohorts from Cumae, opposing art to force, moved a little to one side, and when the enemy, in the impetuosity of their career, had passed them, faced about and attacked their rear. By these means the Etrurians, after almost having gained the victory, were surrounded and cut to pieces. A very small part of them, their general being lost, and no place of safety nearer, made the best of their way to Rome, without arms, and in their circumstances and appearance merely like suppliants. They were kindly received and provided with lodgings. When their wounds were cured, some of them returned home, and gave an account of the hospitality and kindness which they had experienced. A great number remained at Rome, induced by the regard which they had contracted for their host and for the city. They had ground allotted to him for building houses, which was afterwards called the Tuscan Street. The next elected consuls were Publius Lucretius and Publius Valerius Publicola for a third time. During this year, ambassadors came from Porsena for the last time about restoring Tarquinius to the throne. The answer given to them was, that the Senate would send ambassadors to the king, and accordingly, without delay, a deputation, consisting of the persons of the highest dignity among the senators, were sent with orders to acquaint him that it was not because their answer might not have been given in these few words that the kings would not be admitted, that they had chosen to send a select number of their body to him, rather than to give the answer of his ambassadors at Rome, but in order that an end might be put for ever to all mention of that business, and that the intercourse of mutual kindness, at present subsisting between them, might not be disturbed by the uneasiness which might arise to both parties, if he were to request that they would be destructive of the liberty of the Roman people, and the Romans, unless they chose to comply at the expense of their own ruin, must give a refusal to a person to whom they wished to refuse nothing, that the Roman people were not under regal government, but in a state of freedom, and were fully determined to open their gates to declared enemies, rather than to kings. That this was the fixed resolution of every one of them, that the liberty of the city, and the city itself, should have the same period of existence, and therefore to entreat him that if he wished the safety of Rome, he would allow it to continue in its present state. The king, convinced of the importunity of interfering any farther, replied, "Since this is your fixed and unalterable resolution, I shall neither tease you by a repetition of fruitless applications on the same subject, nor will I disappoint the Tarquinii by giving hopes of assistance which they must not expect from me. Let them, whether they look for war or for quiet, seek some other residence in their exile, that there may subsist no cause of jealousy, to disturb henceforth the good understanding which I wish to maintain between you and me." To these expressions he added acts still more friendly. The hostages which remained in his possession he restored, and gave back the Veientian land, of which the Romans had been deprived by the treaty at the Janiculum. Tarquinius, finding all hopes of his restoration cut off, retired for refuge to Tusculum, to his father-in-law, Mamilius Octavius. Thus peace and confidence were firmly established between the Romans and Porsena. The next consuls were Marcus Valerius and Publius Postumius. During this year war was carried on with success against the Sabines, and the consuls had the honour of a triumph. The Sabines afterwards, preparing for a renewal of hostilities in a more formidable manner, to oppose them, and at the same time to guard against any sudden danger which might arise from the side of Tusculum, where, though war was not openly declared, there was reason to apprehend that it was intended, Publius Valerius a fourth time, and Titus Lucretius a second time, were chosen consuls. In the year 250, or 502 B.C., a tumult which arose among the Sabines, between the advocates for peace and those for war, was the means of transferring a considerable part of their strength to the side of the Romans. For Atta Clausus, called afterwards at Rome Appius Claudius, being zealous in favour of peaceful measures, but overpowered by the turbulent promoters of war, and unable to make head against their faction, withdrew from Regulum to Rome, accompanied by a numerous body of adherents. These were admitted to the rights of citizens, and had land assigned to them beyond the Anio. They have been called the old Claudian tribe, to distinguish them from the new members, who, coming from the same part of the country, were afterwards added to that tribe. Appius was elected to the Senate, and soon acquired a reputation among the most eminent. The consuls, in prosecution of the war, marched their army into the Sabine territories, and, after reducing the power of the enemy by wasting their lands, and afterwards in battle, to such a degree that there was no room to apprehend a renewal of hostilities in that quarter for a long time to come, returned in triumph to Rome. In the ensuing year, when Agrippa Manius and Publius Postumius were consuls, died Publius Valerius, a man universally allowed to have excelled all others in superior talents both for war and peace, full of glory, but in such slender circumstances that he left not sufficient to defray the charges of his funeral. He was buried at the expense of the public, and the matrons went into mourning for him, as they had done for Brutus. During the same year, two of the Latine colonies, Pometia and Cora, revolted to the Auruncians, and war was undertaken against that people. A very numerous army, with which they boldly attempted to oppose the consuls who were entering their borders, was entirely routed, and the Auruncians compelled to make their last stand at Pometia. Nor was the carnage less after the battle was over than during its continuance. There greater numbers slain than taken, and those who were made prisoners were in general put to death. Nay, in the violence of their rage, which ought to have been confined to foes in arms, the enemies spared not even the hostages, 300 of whom had been formerly put into their hands. During this year also there was a triumph at Rome. The succeeding consuls, Opiter Reginius and Spurius Cassius, attacked Pometia, at first by storm, afterwards by regular approaches. The Auruncians, actuated rather by implacable hatred than by any hope of success, and without waiting for a favourable opportunity, resolved to assail them, and, sallying out, armed with fire and sword, they filled every place with slaughter and conflagration, and, besides burning the machines, and killing and wounding great numbers of their enemies, were very near killing one of the consuls, which of them writers do not inform us, who was grievously wounded and thrown from his horse. The troops, thus foiled in their enterprise, returned to Rome, leaving the consul, whose recovery was doubtful, together with a great number of wounded. After a short interval, just sufficient for the curing of their wounds and recruiting their army, the Romans renewed their operations against Pometia with redoubled fury and augmented strength, and when they had anew completed their military works, the soldiers just being on the point of scaling the walls, the garrison capitulated. However, although the city had surrendered, the chiefs of the Auruncians were from all parts dragged to execution with the same degree of cruelty, as if it had been taken by assault. The other members of the colony were sold by auction, the town was demolished, and the land set up to sale. The consuls obtained a triumph, rather in consideration of their having gratified the people's resentment by severe revenge than of the magnitude of the war which they had brought to a conclusion. The following year the consuls were Postumius Cominius and Titus Livius, when some Sabine youths, having, through wantonness, used violence to certain courtesans at Rome, during the celebration of the public games, and a mob assembling, a scuffle ensued, which might almost be called a battle, and from this trifling cause matters seem to have taken a tendency towards a renewal of hostilities. Besides the apprehension of a war with the Sabines, there was another affair which created much uneasiness. Undoubted intelligence was received that 30 states had already formed a conspiracy at the instigation of Octavius Mamilius. While Rome remained in this perplexity, looking forward with anxious apprehension to the issue of such a perilous conjuncture, mention was made, for the first time, of creating a dictator. But in what year, or who the consuls were, or who could not be confided in, because they were of the Tarquinian faction, for that is also related, or who was the first person created dictator, we have no certain information. In the most ancient writers, however, I find it asserted that the first dictator was Titus Livius, and that Spurius Cassius was appointed master of the horse. They chose men of consular dignity, as ordered by the law enacted concerning the creation of a dictator. For this reason I am more induced to believe that Lartius, who was of consular dignity, and not Manius Valerius, son of Marcus, and grandson of Volesus, who had not yet been consul, was placed over the consuls, as their director and master, as even if it had been thought proper that the dictator should be chosen out of that family, they would have rather elected the father, Marcus Valerius, a man of approved merit and of consular dignity. On this first establishment of a dictator at Rome, the populace, seeing the axes carried before them, were struck with such terror as made them more submissive to rule, for they could not now, as under the consuls, who were equal in authority, hope for protection from one of them against the other, but prompt obedience was required of them, and in no case was there any appeal. Even the Sabines were alarmed at the appointment of a dictator by the Romans, the more so because they supposed that he had been named to act against them. They therefore sent ambassadors to treat of an accommodation, who, requesting of the dictator and senate that they would pardon the misconduct of thoughtless young men, were answered that pardon would be granted to young men, but not to the old, who made it their constant practice to kindle one war after another. However, a negotiation was entered into for an adjustment of affairs, and it would have been concluded if the Sabines had been willing to reimburse the costs expended on the war, for that was the condition required. War was proclaimed, but still a suspension of hostilities continued during the remainder of the year. The consuls of the next year were Servius Sulpicius and Manius Tullius. Nothing worth mentioning occurred. Then succeeded Titus Abutius and Gaius Vetusius. In their consulate, Fidenae was besieged, Crustumeria taken, Praenestae revolted from the Latins to the Romans, and a Latine war, the seeds of which had for several years past been growing to maturity, could not now be choked. Aulus Postumius, dictator, and Titus Albutius, master of the horse, the year 255, 497 B.C., marching out a numerous army of cavalry and infantry, met the forces of the enemy at the lake Regillius in the territory of Tusculum, and as it was known that the Tarquinii were in the army of the Latines, the rage of the Romans could not be restrained, but they insisted on engaging instantly. For this reason, too, the battle was unusually obstinate and bloody, for the generals not only performed the duty of directing everything, but exposing their own persons, mixed with the combatants, and shared the fight, and scarcely one of the principal officers of either army left the field without being wounded, except the Roman dictator. As Postumius was encouraging and marshalling his men in the first line, Tarquinius Superbus, though now enfeebled by age, spurred on his horse furiously against him, but receiving a blow, was quickly surrounded by his own men and carried off to a place of safety. On the other wing, Aebutius, the master of the horse, made an attack on Octavius Mamilius, nor was his approach unobserved by the Tusculan general, who advanced in full career to meet him, and each aiming his spear at his antagonist, they encountered with such violence that the arm of Aebutius was pierced through, and Mamilius received a wound in his breast. The latter was received by the Latines in their second line, while Aebutius, disabled by the wound in his arm from wielding a weapon, retired from the fight. The Latine general, not in the least dispirited by his wound, continued his vigorous exertions, and perceiving his men begin to give ground, sent for a cohort of Roman exiles, commanded by Lucius, the son of Tarquinius. These, fighting under the impulse of keen resentment, on account of their having been deprived of their property and of their country, kept the battle for some time in suspense. End of Book 2, Part 3.